Hello, my name is Steve Price. I'm actually Dr. Price, and I have been in the practice of emergency medicine for approximately 30 years. I went to an accelerated program and graduated in the early 90s, did my residency then in emergency medicine, and have been in practice since then. But about 3 years ago, I pulled back from the full-time practice of medicine and kind of changed career paths. I still work in the emergency department on a very limited basis as I have needed to devote more time to other pursuits. Um, I wanted to address those in the healthcare field as it concerns all the various matters that have happened around us of late. During my years of medicine, I remember several significant incidents. Back before I actually started training, there was a natural catastrophe in Kansas City where I live of the Hyatt Regency disaster where over 100 people were killed. I started my medical school training the next year. Then, of course, in the early 2000s, we had 9/11, which was a huge terrorist incident, and people died. And then I remember several years ago, actually just in the last decade, we had the significant illness with H1N1. And I remember very clearly having young people in their 30s and 40s coming into my emergency department. They would have respiratory difficulty. I would admit them, and the next day I was coding them, and they would die. And that was a pretty big eye opener then. I remember, for example, one patient who had a pregnancy. She delivered the baby. The next day, I coded her, and she died. And I think all of us in medicine come across things in our paths that don't make sense. And this COVID-19 virus doesn't make sense. And I have to tell you that during all of these events, it has really been challenging to my faith because it doesn't make sense. That's the one thing about people in the medical field. We like it to make sense so that we can have a general idea of why we're doing what we're doing and the reason that we do what we do. And when you come across these sort of large scale events that take away lots of life and cause morbidity, mortality, and loss of family members, it's hard, isn't it? And maybe you've come to that point yourself. And what I'm trying to say is I've faced several of those over my career, and they've challenged my faith. I thought I'd just tell you a little bit of this story. Back when I first started medical school, my faith was definitely challenged. I was raised in a home that read the Bible and a church that was Bible believing. And when I went to medical school, everything I learned had been challenged. And I came close, very close, to just walking away from my faith, thinking that it was a hoax and that it was really archaic, and to a postmodern mindset, it was really quite um, fairy tale like, legend like. And I have to confess, I came very close to walking away. I think the theory that shook me the most was cultural relativism, and how can we say what we believe is appropriate for another culture? It's all relative. It's a sociologic theory that actually has a measure of teeth to it, and that really bothered me. And so what happened was I decided that I needed to know for sure if what I believed was accurate. So I scraped the slate clean. I started over, and I began to, well, decide if this Bible even had any value. Was it true, or just a bunch of really well orchestrated fairy tales? And the one thing that struck me as perhaps the greatest proof was if the Bible would say something at a certain date and then it would happen as it said it, well, that would be phenomenal because we don't have anybody that can do that ever, ever. Even those who proclaim that they can tell the future or foretell the future, their actual accurate success rate is very, very low. And but if this document predicted and it happened, I wondered what its success rate was. And so I began to study the Bible based on that theory alone. And when I did that, I came across an astounding statistic based on my own particular study. I didn't read anybody else's stuff. And what I found was that there was not just a 80% success rate of prediction. It wasn't 90, it wasn't even 99, it was 100%. Now, what is the statistical probability of being 100% right all the time? Those of us in the sciences were familiar with the bell-shaped curve, and at least some percentage, 2.5% perhaps, 2.5% of the time, you're going to be wrong. So what's the statistical probability of being 100% right all the time? It doesn't exist, and yet this document seemed to have evidence that showed it was 100% right all the time. So, when you look at, for example, predictions about world rulers and world empires, who can predict that? Who will predict the next great world empire in 100 years? Is it a country we know today? Is it a country that we know that we won't know tomorrow, that will be there tomorrow, for example? We didn't know. And yet, this document predicted multiple world orders in succession, even down to naming, for example, King Cyrus of his regime. He actually named his name. It was written about, predicted 200 to 250 years thereabouts prior to his installment as king. Now, let me tell you, can you predict who's going to be president in 250 years? Do you think we'll have a country in 250 years? The point is that there is no human way possible to do that, even on this one statistic alone. But there's not one statistic. There is hundreds of statistics, data points that actually verify the veracity and the accuracy of this document. And that alone began to make me think, if that is true, if this document can be true to that level, then maybe I should pay some attention to it. Now, there was one other thing that really helped me then, that in my objective investigation, I felt I was being as unbiased as I possibly could be. Granted, we always have bias, but I really tried to divorce myself from that. And the one thing that was really notable to my attention was this. This document in itself was written over several millennia. In fact, it was written over probably two and a half millennia, thereabouts, about 2 millennia. And what you find is that there are somewhere around 40 to 42 authors, somewhere in there. And they all came from various levels of background. Some were, workers, laborers with their hands. Some were shepherds. Some were doctors, and some were just simply guys that were kings, and others were unknowns to society. And yet, when you look at their collective information from front to back and back to front, what you find is that there is no internal discrepancies at all. Now, I practice emergency medicine, and have practiced emergency medicine. I go to the conferences like you do, updates, board review classes. And, there's generally some consensus on the general principles of emergency medicine and medicine in general, but there's also a whole slew of literature that talk about other ways to practice medicine for a very common disease. Some of them are far-fetched, some of them are well-founded, some of them are investigative. But the point is that we all live in the same culture, in the same time, we're doing the same job, And yet we have a huge difference of opinion on various aspects of medicine. Now, how is it that we then come to rely on medicine, and we can't rely on a document that has none of those factors in its favor? Multiple different authors over thousands of years that have varying social economic strata and levels of education, and they all seem to be consistent in the one singular message. Now, I don't know what you think, but I can't refuse that statistic. That statistic is profoundly strong. So at that point in my life, I decided that this book must be true. And as a result, as I decided that if it's true, then I probably have to agree with its statement that I must be accountable to the God who wrote the book, because he says so. And that was hard. That was hard. To accept the truth of something is one thing. A lot of patients do that. Yeah, I know if I smoke, I'm going to have a heart attack. A lot of them say that. But to put myself under the authority of that statement and order myself accordingly, now that's something different. We all know how hard it is to get patients to quit smoking or to eat the right kind of diet. For them to follow our counsel, that's a whole different, another realm of reality. And I decided I needed to enter into that realm and begin to order my life if I really believed this was true. If I believed it was true but didn't want to order my life to it, then quite honestly, I really didn't believe it was true, did I? If you really believed that you were going to die if you smoked cigarettes, you wouldn't smoke cigarettes, would you? And I felt that I needed to do more than just simply acknowledge its accuracy. That's not true belief. So I did. I did. And over the years, now it's been 30 years since that decision, I have never regretted that. And in our current climate, when things happen like H1N1 and COVID-19 causes incredible concern about, what does this mean? How could God do this? I began to then take those questions and go to this document that seemed to have enough evidence to support its veracity. And I learned a few things that are hard to swallow but are very, very accurate. It's funny that we have this kind of this perspective which is somewhat, quite honestly, a little bit narrow. We come to this point in history where we live, and we have a beginning and an end, and that's all of our vision that we can see. And we look at it and we say, wow, look at all these natural catastrophes, the tsunami, H1N1, COVID-19. God, if you can fix it, why wouldn't you do so? That's what we say. And even as now a Christian, sometimes that question pops into my mind. And I realized that, it's a little bit different. The context is not as simple as that. The context begins with mankind rebelling against God. That was the beginning of the whole event, the whole chain reaction. And as a result of that rebellion, event after event documented in the biblical record shows a very exponential rate of increasing, basically, wickedness, evil, the worst of man, coming out right from the word go. And that's because we adopted as our own a very rebellious, anti-God nature. And that nature is in every human being. And what we do is we have this conscience, which sort of the Bible talks about as being that which would be like an internal compass. God put it there. And when we do these things which are wrong, our conscience kind of screams at us and says that's wrong. And so we try to curb that bent towards doing evil, doing wrong things, doing hateful things. Sometimes our masking of that is very successful, and to the naked eye, a person seems to be very wholesome, a good person, a good woman, a good man. That's what we say. But in reality, there is underneath maybe a heart that you can't see. That was me. That's what I had. And maybe you have that too. And the truth is, you can't escape it, can you? It just screams at you. Even in actions that are wholesome and good, generosity by giving things to the indigent and helping those who can't care for themselves. We do it all the time, don't we, as doctors? We do. But yet, if you get me in another setting, I'm just as selfish and wicked and prideful and arrogant as I can be. And as a doctor, I recall times where I was absolutely arrogant. Now, how do you get rid of that? You can't. God has to step in to get rid of that for you. And that's what God did. So all that you see with the COVID-19 and H1N1, we want to say that it's really God's fault or it's God's responsibility to fix it. But the truth is, it's the natural outcome of what started way back with my own rebellious nature. And you say, well, Steve, are you sure about that? All these diseases come because of that? That seems ludicrous. I know it seems ludicrous, but it actually is true. It actually is true. Now, what's happening is that there is a statement that God is making, and that inevitably everyone will have to face a sense of judgment before the God who has title to, who owns the title to your existence. We want to say, God, you don't have a right to touch me, but the truth is He does, whether you admit it or not. And as a result of that, He allows that which is catastrophic, that varies, sometimes it's catastrophic, sometimes it's not. But He has this varying levels of catastrophe, really to point out one very solid truth. You will eventually need to give an accounting or an accountability to God Himself. And if you don't face that reality, what happens is you'll never face that reality until you actually stand before God. God, therefore, in what He would call merciful activity, prolongs the inevitable facing of God face to face, so that you might have a chance to reconsider what you're actually doing with your life and the way you regard God. Now, my friends, that's what's happening. Sometimes there is an allowance of life to be lost, but it's really to help us consider the reality of where we're at. Yeah, I've had questions. I had friends, acquaintances pass away from COVID-19, but I'm reminded of the finality of life. No one escapes death. No one escapes that endpoint. It doesn't matter how healthy we are, how rich we are, or how popular we are. That always is the final endpoint of every human being. And I think that should tell us something. That should tell us that we have a moment when we will actually have to face God eye to eye. And when that happens, what will be your answer? Now, the only answer that we could give at that moment, if it were to happen today, is that I have no answer. I'm guilty. I rebelled and I stayed rebellious and I hid it well, but it's the truth. And so God steps in. You see, this is the mercy of God. And this mercy of God does this. He steps in and He says, I know who you are. I know what you are, but I'm stepping in on your behalf. I cannot change what you are or what you've done because of who you are, but I can pay the penalty of your crimes so that you can be released from that. And when that happens, I can actually make you a new person, like a criminal who gets released from jail. The issue is that we don't want to admit that I need that kind of help. What God precisely did is He entered the human race in the person of Jesus Christ. And he voluntarily, not because somebody was actually making a conspiracy against him, but he voluntarily allowed the whole thing to occur, knowing every detail, so that he could actually pay the ultimate penalty, capital punishment for my sin. And it sounds amazing, but God would so justified, vindicated by raising him from the dead. He says, when all that happens, I'll tell you what, I can now provide for the human race what it can't do for itself. You see, I can't change the inevitable outcome of breaking the judicial system. The law is the law. But I can take care of the penalty of the law so that I can bear it myself, and those who are categorically guilty can actually be saddled with a categorical proclamation of being justified by the law because I paid for their penalty. That's what God is saying. And when I understood that, and when I see all of these events in light of that, COVID-19, H1N1, the Twin Towers, all that stuff, when I see it in light of that, what that tells me is something very simple. God has done everything to fix our ultimate problem. And all these events along the way are not to be interpreted as events to impugn God or level accusation against him. Is to remind us of exactly the finality of the end of mankind that ends in death, and how God has accomplished what it takes to remedy that problem. Now, I consider myself somebody who's spent a lot of time in the field of education and medicine. And there's not many doctors that would come to this endpoint and say it this way. But I think I need to. I think I need to say that because the truth is that there are many souls that I treat, many individuals that I treat, and I can't help them. All of us healthcare professionals, we've been there, haven't we? We do everything we can, and they still die. But this is one thing that actually supersedes the best physical medication I could give someone, the best treatment and intervention I could provide for them. So I think I have to say something. And I say that to you, my colleagues. Maybe that's something you must consider too. Not just for your patients, but how about for you? For you personally. Well, I hope this has been an encouragement to you, and just wanted to spend a minute chatting about what's going on.